Okay, so we have with us three amazing faculty members, and they are all from diverse fields. All right, so together they bring a unique perspective to today's discussion on using materials in the classroom while highlighting their collaborative work on a URECA project that integrates art, history, and science to explore cross-disciplinary teaching.
Okay, yeah. So as you can see from the slide, this webinar is about teaching with material objects. So we're really thinking about material objects, and as Jeanette said, the way that they can bring us together across our different disciplines. So we're going to think a little bit about teaching with material objects. We're going to think about that overlap between material objects and interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity. And to do that, we're going to talk through some of our teaching experiences, both individually in our separate classrooms, in our separate disciplines, and then also in collaboration, mostly with one another, but also we're going to mention briefly some collaborations with other faculty members to show how using material objects has helped us to expose our students to other disciplines and other approaches, and how that has, I hope, helped them. So I'm Catherine Hindley. As Jeanette said, I teach medieval literature and paleography, which is the study of ancient handwriting. So I'm working a lot on books from before the era of print, and we will show you some of those later. So how Lisa and Ella and I met. Lisa, I think I met through a lecture series that I was organizing at the National Library about the history of the book and reading. And so Lisa was one of our speakers, which was the first time that we had met one another. And the conversation was fun and it kept going. And so then later I wanted to put together a faculty learning community on this subject of teaching with material objects. Lisa was an obvious person to ask. And then Lisa brought Ella into the group. Ella and I became friends when she said that she wanted to make a knife. I said, me too. And we went on a blacksmith workshop together. So one of the things that has been particularly helpful, I think, both with the faculty learning community and then with our collaborations, is that we are friends with one another, we're interested in one another's work, and that has smoothed this whole process. Ella, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so hi, I'm Ella. My name is really, really long, but everybody knows me as Ella. I'm a chemist. I actually do organic chemistry. We do a lot of this kind of old-fashioned things, where you mix things. They sometimes explode, sometimes, most of the time, they smell bad. When we actually, I met, as Catherine said, I met her, and I think we clicked. And I said, she's my kind of person when we went. And she was cool in saying, like, your knife will kill. It's one of my, that's for those of you that watch TV reality shows, might make sense. And then with Lisa, actually, we met because of my selfish need of an artist, because I had this idea of some posters in mind, but everything that was in my mind, it was never really coming reality. And that's when I wrote Lisa, and I was like, can you help? And then I let Lisa follow through from there.
So I met Ella through another mutual colleague, actually, and he put us in touch with each other, and we formed a really great relationship whereby in my illustration for designers course, we go over to Ella's chemistry lab. I get my art and design students to do some chemistry experiments and really understand what it might be like to be a scientist for the day. And they take this inspiration and they take this as a catalyst back to the creative classroom. And they've created a lot of illustrations based on the research that Ella does, and through a lot of the objects in the laboratory has inspired their illustration projects. So we have collaborated, I think, since 2021 on this through various different iterations. And we've had some really beautiful illustrations out from this project that have been published on the front cover of some really good, I am told, chemistry journals. I think, I don't know how they are tiered, but knowing Ella, I'm sure they are the best of the best. So that's how we met. And I think, are we on to the next slide, Catherine?
Sure.
Yeah, as I said, I introduced Ella and Catherine, so it's all my fault.
Yeah, so then the kind of thing that brought us together, thinking about material objects specifically, is this faculty learning community. So we got a grant from the university to set one of these up on the topic of teaching with material objects. And so you can see on here some of the posters for events that we've run in the past, which hopefully some of you came to. So what we wanted to think about in this community was using material objects in the classroom. And so anything from biological specimens, botany, anatomy, archaeological artifacts, medieval manuscripts. I think in our first session, we did a sort of show and tell. Lisa brought pasta.
and
so all kinds of things that you can use in the classroom that are material. So bringing together faculty members from disciplines that use objects in different ways to teach different things, and getting them to share their experiences and their best practices, and seeing if we can strengthen everybody's practice through discussion. So there's a lot of research that shows the benefits of teaching with material objects, in particular, because a material object is a complex real world item. Students, when they approach it, they have to consider a variety of evidence. And so they're engaging all of their senses to understand the object, and coming at the object from multiple angles helps to strengthen their analytical skills and their problem solving skills, because they're having to choose the best type of evidence and kind of filter out what's less important for their argument. And so these are experiences that can't always be replicated with digital surrogates. You can do wonderful things with digital objects and digitized versions of physical things, but you miss that hands-on aspect. And also some of the excitement, I think, that students feel when they're confronted with something that they're not used to seeing in the classroom. So just to quickly show you, this is from one of the first chapters that we read in the faculty learner community. And this is from a guide for teaching in museums. And you can see that it's showing a really wide range of questions that you might bring to an object. So it's thinking specifically about museum objects. We came up with more questions in the FLC as we started to bring in other disciplines and other types of objects. But one of the things that's nice about teaching with a material object is that the students might come to the object from any of these categories of investigation that you see around the edge of this diagram. And so it's something where you can have both a really focused assignment where you've given them an object, but they can still direct their project according to their own interest or their discipline. So lots of scope for students to explore their own interests, even within a relatively narrow assignment. So if we briefly introduce to you how each of us uses material objects in our own classrooms separately, then we'll talk about how we bring them together. So my main material objects collection is a book history teaching collection. So I bought this using an edX grant specifically for a class in the history of the book. So that's thinking about the technology of making and sharing text, both physical and digital, how that changes over time, and how that influences practices of reading and understanding texts. So we have all of the items on the screen here are items that belong to NTU. So we use the items in the collection in the classroom, and we also do trips when we can we visited the Heritage Conservation Centre to think about paper conservation. We visited the Straits Times printing press to think about how printing works on an industrial scale now. And so this is trying to get the students to bring the sort of theoretical readings that they're doing and the preparation that they're doing in class, and then see how it's actually working in practice. And I now bring these objects into almost all of my classes, regardless of whether we're thinking about material objects specifically, just because the students tend to get so excited about having something that's really old in the classroom with them. So on this slide, you can see some 15th century items, and that tends to get them very excited. But I realized recently it doesn't even have to be old. So this is for a different one of my classes where we're thinking about alchemy. What is a it's my own reproduction of an alchemical scroll that's giving you instructions to how to create the Philosopher's Stone. But I just had this printed at the print shop in the basement of SOA. And the students are like, just because it's different, they're up on their feet, they're crouching around looking at it. It brings a different energy to the classroom. Ella, do you want to introduce yours?
So yeah, so from my point of view, it looks like almost teaching with toys, because we use, I'm just showing it here, what is in the picture. So the way I use these toys, it's almost like Lego blocks that the students have to put together to create the molecules. So why I choose to use this, what we call molecular models, is because, as you see, I don't have I cannot point on it, but it's the structure on the top left side on the screen. Is basically, that's what you will see in a textbook. If you are a chemist and you're a student, this is what you will see in a textbook, and it's a very simplified way of representing a molecule. But this is how we draw it, and what we expect the students to see is what is on the top right. So that's what's written. What we expect our students to have in the mind is the molecule that's in the top, on the top right. And sometimes, and a lot of time, the translation from the simple thing to the complex one, to the 3D representation of the molecule, the students are struggling a little bit with. And that's why bringing this kind of toys in the classroom, it allows the students to take it in their hands and rotate it, play with it. They can take it apart, they can put it together, and all these kind of things. And on top of that, in chemistry, we go from one model to the other depending on what we need actually to talk about, what reaction, what reactivity, what kind of aspect of the molecule that we want to bring in. So if you can believe, all of these representation that you see in the chemical formula, it represent exactly the same molecule. And sometimes, even if I'm honest with you, even after 20-something years of experience in chemistry, I'm struggling, or I need a bit of time to go from one representation to the other. And that's why many times having this toy, these Lego blocks that you can put apart and then put together, helps, depending what do you need with it. So that's how one of the way we use models or objects in my class. And sometimes even we take even a chair, and then we have the exercise of like, how do you look at the chair and how do we rotate the molecules move around. And I find it interesting because some of my students are telling me, oh, I have the molecule in my mind and I rotate it when I have to look from a different side. Because one of my students said something very interesting, that she said that, oh, I actually have the molecules in my mind and I'm walking around the molecule and I'm placing myself on one atom or the other and so on. And this was possible just because they can hold this model in their hands, and then they get the feeling of how the molecule looks like. So then...
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I was exactly finished.
Okay.
Hey, I guess that means that I am up. So what you see here is some photographs that I took on an excursion that we made to the Natural History Museum as part of the faculty learning community. So all of the insects here, I was absolutely fascinated by these as objects within the Natural History Museum. And so I took photographs of them because I was so inspired by their beauty and the textures and their shape and their form. And I knew I'd be able to repurpose these within my classroom. So one of the reasons that I found them so beautiful was because I was able to make visual metaphor from their shape. All of the insects are actually native to Singapore. They're all airborne. And so I was really inspired by choreography. I looked at this as a form of nature's choreography and how we can utilize these creatures in our various different graphic forms. So I was looking at their color, I was looking at their texture, I was looking at their shapes and seeing how we could make visual metaphor with those. Could you share the next slide, please, Catherine? And so as I'm a visual communication designer, and a lot of what I do is poster design work. So I was able to take the objects that we saw in the museum, reinterpret those through photography, and then reinterpret them again through graphic pattern and typography to actually create posters that looked at sustainability and environmental issues. So I could then use these posters in my classroom to discuss environmental issues, to discuss the biological and societal issues around all of these creatures and their relevance to Singapore as well, building in elements and principles of design. So I think the objects here fulfilled several of the criteria on the sort of little diagram that Catherine introduced to you all previously.
Yeah, so one of the things that we found, one of the things that lends material objects to this kind of interdisciplinary approach is that you've heard how each of us use objects in our separate classrooms, but then you can also see that we might all approach the same object with different questions. And so this is a manuscript leaf from the teaching collection here. So I would approach this and wonder, what is the text? When was this made? Who might have owned this? But Lisa and Ella, you have different questions about this kind of object.
See, for example, I would look at this and I would think like, oh my God, this is 400 years old. How did the colors last for so long? Why did they not
than
the
that.
structure? What's the structure of the pigment inside and all kind of things? And I'm assuming Lisa has a different point of view. So
yeah, I'd be interested in the illustrative elements of it. How does the calligraphy relate to contemporary typography? How are the illuminated elements represented either historically or could be reinterpreted in a contemporary way? And also the materiality of it. What was, I'm assuming that this is this paper, Catherine, or is this like a vellum? Parchment?
Yeah.
So what would the material look like, again, if we interpreted this in a more contemporary manner? Again, what are the societal, cultural implications that surround this? I could go on and on. There's many
But
questions.
instead we will make everybody else go on and on. So just to let everybody have a chance to think about this, we've picked an object. It is a crocodile. And just for 2 minutes in the chat, if you put a way that your discipline might approach this object, something that you would be interested in from your professional angle in discovering about this thing. So we'll give you 2 minutes and then we'll continue.
Yeah, we're really interested to hear how you might approach this as a object within your classroom, not a live crocodile.
Yes, that's true. Although a live crocodile in the classroom, I bet the students would get excited.
Yes, indeed. Probably not
too excited.
Though. Not one of this size, at least, anyway. So yeah, please do pop in the chat how you might approach this in your discipline. And then we can maybe share about how we'd approach it in ours.
okay, I can see actually, Rebecca, that's a very interesting take on the thing. I would never think of this take with like dangers of misinformation. This is interesting. Would you care to, Rebecca, would you care to unmute yourself and just maybe in one sentence develop a little bit what do you mean by that?
Okay, so I was looking at the crocodile's mouth and thinking that it represents danger, not to go near. So at the medical library, we do teach the students how to steer away from misinformation. And we also connect with patient networks here. So the public also needs to be aware in terms of not misinterpreting or be misinformed on the types of treatments that's being offered. For example, like the COVID-19, there was a lot of misinterpreted information that circulated around regarding the vaccines. So I was just thinking about that with the representation of this crocodile figure here.
That's really interesting.
It is very interesting. I think you've approached this in a similar way. I approached the sort of insects in terms of it served as a metaphor, which is a really cool way, I think, to engage students with conversations on topics that they might be unfamiliar with. Does anyone else have any suggestions? That's interesting to look at the emotions of the predator. I hadn't actually thought about considering from the perspective of the crocodile, actually.
No, me neither. I'd thought about maybe like, why has it evolved to look like this? Why is the crocodile, what's the crocodile? How does it live that makes this the best shape for a crocodile to be? What I don't know, why am I defining evolution? But not about the way that the crocodile might feel or behave.
It's very interesting. Thank you for sharing. So I think we had a little bit of discussion. Maybe we can move on, just in the interest of time. We can move on to the next idea. So basically all these things, material objects, my collaboration with Lisa, and then us becoming friends and going for dinners and things like that, led to another idea. And last year we explored for the first time the idea of bringing two undergrads together with us to look how can we combine the science and more specifically chemistry with design. We started with a completely different thing in mind, and then as always things evolve, and then how can we make the best out of it. We ended up in exploring the usage of pigments from the plants around NTU, and then trying to bring them into the design. So from our perspective, from the chemist point of view, it was quite a little bit of trial and error, how to get the pigments, how to separate them, how to make them look nice and things like that. And then we went to the design part, and I'm going to let Lisa talk about the design part.
Sure. So the inks that were developed from Ella's lab, we then took them to our visual communication studio workshop, and we tried to utilize them on our letterpress. So not only was it using the ink as an object to create, it was also utilizing the letterpress machine as well to develop prints from that project. One thing I did want to observe was how scared of the machine our students were. And I think looking back on it now, like with some fresh perspective, it was perhaps because they're so used to this sort of digital environment now. Something like a letterpress machine, which they'd never handled before, they were so scared to break it. And it does require some degree of force. So that was really interesting to observe how they actually acted around objects or machinery instead of a digital environment. And I think when you're utilizing things like this in your classroom, that's something that you should really be aware of to help the students feel comfortable with the objects that they're working with, assuming that they can touch them.
Sorry.
Is there anything else you wanted to say, Ella, before?
No, actually, because you brought up this thing, so it happened that when we went for the letterpress, my niece, that it's 14 years old, and Lisa's daughter joined us, so they were way more upfront and way more willing to go and interact and press and mix the things than sometimes our students are. So I think this is a behavior that is developed as well, and so it was really an interesting point of view to see that this digital thing is developing in time.
Definitely so. And so from this sort of collaboration between myself and Ella in the URECA project, we thought it would be a wonderful opportunity to bring Catherine in as well. So this year we're working on another URECA project with 3 new students, and this time it is design plus chemistry plus humanities. Catherine, do you want to add on to how your perspective enters into the conversation?
Yeah, so the URECA project that I proposed, so it's 3 separate URECA projects, but then we're requiring them to work together. So the project I proposed was for a student to think about the history of handwritten books and their decoration. The idea being that the student will look at either the books themselves or the way that they're described in literary texts, and that will serve as inspiration for the designer, to Lisa's student, and then the chemist will be extracting the pigments that we use as well. And so the student this year has decided to focus on Malay manuscripts and their decoration, trying to look at how religious manuscripts are decorated differently to secular manuscripts. And so we have this nice kind of regional collaboration or focus on the region with the plants that we found on the campus, the kind of local materials that my student is looking at. And then I think Lisa's student is quite interested also in a sustainability aspect, trying to use things that come from the local area. So Lisa, do you want to say something about that as well?
Yes, I think that
I have a
is
slide
what-
for you.
Yes,
No,
please.
I just have this slide.
Here's a lovely picture of us all in the lab. So we are collaborating as much as the students. We were all together. We spent the whole Saturday in the lab, and yet the focus from the design perspective, at least, is to try and make this project as sustainable as possible, utilizing materials from the NTU campus, utilizing the waste products from the pigment extraction to potentially make paper to print on as well. And then the ink would then be used to develop some design. The design is still in question at the minute. We're still deciding on the direction, but hopefully we're going to be informed from what Catherine's literature student finds out, and we can use that information to create designs with sustainably sourced ink and sustainably sourced paper, which I think leads me nicely into another sustainability project that I have worked on. Could we go to the next slide? I think that was just a quick intro. Yes, here we go. So I also teach a design thinking module, which is co-taught with another one of our faculty learning community members, Associate Prof Hindley from Material Science Engineering, sorry. And this is co-taught, and we have a multidisciplinary cohort as well. So the course is open to MSc, ADM, and then we do have a number of slots that are open to any student in NTU. So we get people from the business school, we get people from, we've had chemistry students, we've had students from SOH, we've got social scientists. It's free for all. Next slide, please, Catherine. And every year in this course, we work with a different community partner. One iteration, we worked with an NGO called Ground Up Initiative, who have a kampong style education space where they have an urban farm. They have educational craft workshops and an earth oven, amongst other things. Next slide, please. And what we try and teach our students is that the sort of regular mode of consumption that our society has taken upon itself is a take, make, dispose, linear economy, which is very unsustainable. And so this course, or this particular iteration of this course, was much more about engaging a circular economy, which looks at how we design, make, and reuse objects with the explicit goal of reducing residual waste. So how we can better work with raw materials and how we can better understand the creative process so that there's less waste, basically. Next slide, please. And so our students went out to Ground Up Initiative and did a lot of observation while they were there and interviewed a lot of the staff. And one of the things that they found that there's a huge mosquito problem in the area. But given that Ground Up Initiative is like a zero waste NGO, they didn't want to use chemical treatments to get rid of the mosquitoes. So our students came up with a really, what I think was an innovative solution using material objects. Ground Up Initiative, they have a kitchen. Within that kitchen, they use a lot of oranges. So the peels are usually discarded. What the students found was that mosquitoes really hate citrus. And so they decided that if they researched, found a method that was already in existence. You can dry your orange peel, blend this into a fine powder, and then this ignites and can be burned like an incense. And then, as I mentioned previously, Ground Up Initiative also have a woodworking educational department that uses repurposed woods from wooden pallets, but there is a lot of scraps and offcuts. So the students created a wooden device that would serve as a portable incense burner that the staff could take around with them while they're working. And they did lots of tests, and it was a very effective mosquito repellent. I think we could have the next slide, please. And there we go. This is the very, it looks really rudimentary. It's not pretty, but it doesn't need to be. It's this circular economy. They're using all of the waste products to solve a problem. And they've then developed this whole process into a workshop that Ground Up Initiative can then deliver to the general public and actually make into a commercial making activity. So the object was not only a solution to a design thinking problem, it was also a catalyst for sustainable theoretical thinking and all of the underpinning research that was put into the notion that citrus peel would be a good mosquito repellent. And I've tried it, it does work. And I think that is...
Catherine, we can go to the next one, maybe. So this more or less brings us to the end. We hope that we shared a bit of what our experience and inspires you, and hopefully through this you got the idea that the objects, how do we define objects and material objects, it's very varied. From Catherine's manuscripts to my toys, to Lisa's go visit to the museums and how to interact with the structure. There are a lot of ways to bring the objects in your class, and there are different approaches going from cultural. Basically, you can go from what is represented in a certain time, a cultural aspect, to a more material kind of approach, and then we hope that this gives you a bit of a feeling and how you could use actually, and if you use objects in your class. And we would love to hear a bit of your thoughts. If you use, what objects are you using in your teaching, how do you use them, if you use them, what are some of barriers that prevent you in using them, or do you have difficulties? And if you do not, maybe you think, or maybe something that we told you now or today brings it to your mind, how could you reintroduce the object to your teaching?
I'm also from ADM. Thank you very much for your sharing. I'm really fascinated, and I think it's great that you come together, and also how you collaborate also on the URECA project, how you find a way of collaborating. I think it's really great. No, I just want to share that I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I have a documentary film class, and I also have ideas about the crocodile, but I found old photos on a secondhand store in Singapore, and it's like photos from the 1970s, 80s, showing people how they portrait them in Singapore in front of monuments. Yeah, and I always use these still photos as a kind of way of thinking about history, about heritage, about photography, and also a way of making a film with still photos, because not everyone is in the beginner class knows how to handle a camera and the sound and everything together. So this is my material. I use always these photos that I find on secondhand stores. Just an example.
Really, actually cool.
Really cool.
I think one of the things that's nice about teaching with objects is that sometimes the objects can be so cheap and easy, right? Like you're finding these at secondhand shops. I've got things in my collection that I bought literally for 50 cents at charity bookshop. And once you give the student the right angle to approach these things, they become so valuable in the classroom.
Right.
See, I would look at the picture like that, and I would immediately think like, what a waste going to digital. You don't get to print the thing. You don't get to go in a black room and get your hands stained by silver and things like that. So
Right. Yes, they also have different sizes and different materials, and some are faded, and so some students make films about the history of film, or about photography, and some are like looking at where is it shot, and so many places in Singapore disappeared. Some of these locations don't exist anymore. So there's so many avenues you can think about it.
That's really interesting that the object could be a process of documentation, as well as and incite conversations about historical context, social context, materiality, as you say. That there's so many different ways that one object could be interpreted, even in the context of just filmmaking. If we took it out, I'm sure Ella would be able to tell us all about the chemical components of how the developing process and things like that. I'm saying I'm sure. I hope.
I'm not. I'm not capable, but that's not my expertise. But I think I could understand better. I could find out how and what was the chemistry behind it, actually.
I really like the analogy of using, like, referring to teaching with objects as with toys. I thought that was really fun. It's really fun when you actually get to see the materials, the things that you are learning, and being able to physically touch the object and all that. But just also thinking about, you've commented that students are so used to using technology, right? Digital technology, I think was Lisa that mentioned it. And thus they actually very apprehensive when it comes to when they have the opportunity to use material. So I'm just wondering, to what extent that you see that this is, do you see that actually there are, because actually teaching with material is something that has been used for a very long time in education. In the past, teachers have been using materials for teaching and all that. Do you see that there are like a reduction in the use of material in teaching, and is it a cause for alarm, or you think that is a natural progression?
In my field, because the objects that we're dealing with are often valuable and historical, I mean, like, if it's less than 500 years old, I no longer care about it. So those are things that people often want to keep safe. And in the past, there has not really been an option except for to show them to the students if you're trying to teach the student about them. And as there's been more digitization, I think there's been a real shift towards students accessing the digital version instead. And one of the things that worries me about that is you need to know how to handle the object. And so it's not enough for you to work on a digital reproduction until you're halfway through your PhD, and then suddenly you get let loose on the real thing, because it handles differently. To, like, parchment and paper do not behave in the same way. So there's also a kind of, one of the reasons that I wanted the teaching collection is that there's the student confidence in knowing that they can handle the material properly and safely. But then also I think it serves the materials better if by the time they get to something which is more unique, everything is unique in some sense, but like, if they're going to look at like the one copy of Beowulf that survives, I don't want them not knowing how to handle that object. And I think particularly as students get even less and less reading print books, they read on iPads and phones and so on. And so just being accustomed to the kind of physical interaction with the object, I think, is safer both for the object and for the students' confidence in the field.
No, from my point of view, actually, this is one. We are chemists, so chemistry, by definition, at least from my point of view, it requires a lot of hands work, manual work, and so on. And then because of all these digital things, sometimes the students are coming a little bit surprised that they have to go and do reaction, that they have to do this, when then there's a little bit of a disconnect sometimes from what you write on the paper to what happens in the lab, how do you interact with the chemicals? They are dangerous. I always tell my students that you have to respect the chemicals and they are going to respect you back and things like that. So, and then there's a little bit of a pushback is like, but I can click, because during the pandemic, we asked them to do experiments on the computer, basically clicking when they see the color change and things like that. And it's not the same thing like being in the lab. So well, I think the digital thing has a role in the life, but in the same time, as a chemist, I think from my point of view, being a chemist means that you have to be able to go to the lab and so the material objects are extremely important and you have to be able to interact with the things.
I think from my point of view, and I'm going to sound like a really old dinosaur now, when I was in school, we had like one computer lab for the entire like design program. And so everything that I did was done by hand first. I learned how to set type using something called letter set, where you like rub down each of the letters. I learned how to illustrate by hand and then bring it all together on paper, cut and paste. So, and again, it was all about the sort of materiality of it. Being a packaging designer in the UK, I had to think about the three-dimensional aspects of design, how it would sit on a shelf, how people would handle it, what are the ergonomics, things like that. Whereas obviously this is still a big consideration. Packaging design is a huge industry in Singapore. However, I know in the classroom, if I ask my students to sketch and the first thing they do is reach for their iPad. If I give them a pencil and paper, it's like, oh, I don't really know what to do with this. It won't fix the circle to a perfect circle for me when I'm drawing. So I think getting them to do that is a really important aspect of developing as a designer, and to miss that out, again, takes away the sort of experiential aspect of it and the fundamentals of design. So whilst I think asking them to revert back to how I was taught would be a step too far, I still think there's still value in the way that I was taught, and certain aspects of it can still be built into a contemporary classroom, certainly.
Thank you. So I'm very curious about what others are thinking, especially in response to the questions that Catherine posed. If any of you actually don't use material, is there barriers that prevent you? And the linking to other disciplines, really interesting to hear from a different perspective about these questions.
That was actually one of the students from ADM. Just why I wanted to share that, actually, just to encourage you guys. That you're doing the right thing. So yeah, I was so amazed because he's the most quiet guy. Nothing much to say usually in class, and then I was just very surprised by his creativity. So they have to actually come up with a wind-up, right, for their presentation. So he actually did the experiment before his actual presentation. So his wind-up was more like, I did an experiment with my friends, and they did this. They were very curious, they opened it up. So he made us think about, like, yeah, what am I actually looking at? So that gives his presentation an extra level of thoughtfulness, at least. And then I know his background is in film and all that, so I was just appreciating how he managed to bring a bit of himself into his presentation. But I realized I didn't answer your question, so I apologize. I was just excited to share that because it just happened last week. But the whole idea about introducing objects. So why I came for this presentation, in fact, I came for one or two of the other ones that you guys organized as well, because the mod we're teaching has students doing field work, and I have wondered to myself the possibility of bringing material objects to class and getting students to think about, like what you said, questions that you might ask if you're looking at this particular object, right? Different perspectives, and part of the purpose of the course is to bring in different disciplinary perspectives as well. So I have considered it, but I balked on it because I felt like, okay, if I just brought in an object, then students might misunderstand the purpose of the fieldwork, which is to actually visit a place or interview. I might actually isolate the object from the context that they would need to bring in. So that was my reservation, but it's particular to the kind of assignment that they're doing. But otherwise, yeah, I'm really excited by this, and yeah, good work.
Thank you.
And one of the things that like with some of the objects that I've used, it can like really lend itself to a massive exploration. I think maybe something more similar to what Ella was talking about. So the one that really impressed me, one of the items that I have in the collection here is a printing plate to create business cards. And it's from, I can't remember, the 1930s maybe in Ireland. And I had a student who just got really interested in figuring out like exactly when was this thing made. And so she was going and looking at like phone directories from Ireland in like between which year can she find when this business was at this location. And she ended up doing like a huge amount of work about what shops were there, what was the society like, who was living in this place. And it was all just starting from the one object. So there are lots of ways that it can, like, ideally it can move towards that broader understanding. But yeah, I can see that you wouldn't want to distract them from the big field work. I think one of the questions that we've discussed a little bit in the faculty learning community, maybe less than we would have liked, is how you get a student to move from the pre-selected object that you give them in the classroom to like finding their own object out in the world. And for my discipline, that's a little bit easier because everything is like in a library or an archive. But for other disciplines, that's going to be much more of a search, I think.
I do have a question, and I'd just like to ask. I think I hear it quite a bit in what all of you have been sharing, and I would have loved to be a student in your classes. But I just hope to hear from you if you can share about how you may have to approach the design of your learning activities and even the assessment differently in the use of materials. So any experience or challenges perhaps in implementing or using objects for these aspects of your class?
It's one of the things that actually my students are a little bit taken aback, because I said that we use these models in the teaching, in the tutorial, in the class, and then they keep asking if they can bring the models in the exam, and then we tell them no. So it's really they are very taken aback that we want to tell them that, or we want them to use the models to be able to develop a way of writing and expressing their reactions and so on a piece of paper, going from a 3D to a 2D and things like that. And then I think this is one of the challenges when we use the models, that even though the model is meant to help, it should not be the one that you always rely to, or you fall back into it. The model should help you, but you should be able to develop a way of thinking without the model as well.
With mine, I think the main challenge has been getting my students to understand how to use different types of evidence, which is one thing which makes me think that this is actually a really important way to teach. So my students are predominantly literature students. So they're used to using evidence from literary texts. And the history of the book course that I've been mostly talking about is a third-year course typically. So they're quite a way into their program. And it's amazing to me every year how much they struggle to use evidence that isn't from the text. And so I'm saying to them, you're making an argument about the physical object. And so the text might be relevant to why the designer, the publisher, is making the choices that they're making, but you're not making a literary argument. And they don't know how to, some of them do. Many of them really struggle to shift to that different type of evidence. And so I think one of the things that this kind of teaching can do is bring in like a wider sense of what you can include to make the argument that you're making, so that you're choosing what evidence is best for your argument and not what evidence sort of fits within your like narrowly defined disciplinary boundaries. The kind of practical challenges have been making sure that the objects are safe. So somebody once put a medieval manuscript down in a puddle of water from a leaking air conditioning pipe. Luckily, it was in a folder, so it survived, but I nearly had a heart attack. Like, this thing has been around for 600 years, and now you've just like chucked it in a puddle. And then also, if students are absent from class, because the object is only in the classroom, the students aren't able to check these items out of the library by themselves. And so if somebody's on MC or whatever, then they're missing like potentially quite a large proportion of their access to the object for the assignment. So it has meant building in quite a bit of time to, like, if a student is absent, I have to give them time to make up the time like outside of class. So practicality, that can be a bit difficult, but I think it's worth it for the new type of thinking that they hopefully learn to do.
Okay. Thank you so much for your sharing, and thanks for your questions. It's actually 12:01. I'm mindful of the time we have. I think for the benefit of the participants who are here and they need to go, please feel free to leave the meeting. Thanks, Yuni, for providing the feedback link. So I think for the rest of us who still wants to stay back, please feel free to stay back. May I ask the three of you to just stay back for a while for a little chat? Yeah. Okay. So thanks to all for your participation. If I may continue, I'm just really curious, because I think three of you really exemplify how interconnected you are. It's like a live example of the 6 degrees of separation. All of you come from different places and somehow connected by a certain topic. So I'm just wondering, for those who are thinking of, because it really, from the use of material, what comes into life is how different discipline or perspective, right, comes into interpreting what this material actually illuminate in that sense, right? So for those who are interested in doing some form of like cross-disciplinary collaboration and all that, what advice would you provide to them?
Maybe I can start. What I think helped me in collaborating with these lovely, wonderful women, it's being open, being curious about their research, and trying to understand their research as much as I can, my limited understanding of history and things like that. And actually, I learned a lot of things from them, and I was surprised. I'm going to be honest that I was surprised how they approach things comparing with me. And being friends also help. Liking a glass of wine also really helps, So I think, to me, I think curiosity and being open and to the other person approach is the one that helps a lot.
I think, but building on what Ella said, not about the wine, but building about what Ella said in terms of how we collaborate as well. I think immersing ourselves in each other's environments has been really beneficial. Ella's opened her doors to her laboratory, and Catherine and I have visited. Catherine's brought her manuscripts into my ADM classroom, and I've invited everyone to ADM to use the letterpress and explore the metal type that we have here. So again, we've practiced what we've preached to our students and adopted that sort of learning mindset that I'm, as Ella said, the word curious, I think, is really pivotal here. I've kept a really open mind as to the scientific approach, the historical approach, and how that could benefit me as a designer, and hopefully how my design practice could impart wisdom somehow on the others.
And I think we didn't really go into any of this thinking, like, I think there's a lot more has come out of this than I expected.
Yeah.
And so partly when we were talking to one another, like, I think some of my initial questions to Lisa were very basic stuff about her discipline. Like, I want to know this thing. Can you like tell me about typography or whatever? So it's starting just from that very basic level of like, you're an expert and I'm not, and can you help me? And then like, as we realize that we're interested in similar questions and that we like spending time with one another, it's grown into all of these different aspects. And the faculty learning community has accelerated that because it put us in touch with, like, we spend more time together through the faculty learning community, and then also with other people who are kind of interested in the same things. So I think finding somebody who's like-minded, but also approaching it from their disciplinary perspective almost. So like, I'm not going to Lisa and saying, help me with this thing that will only benefit me. It's like, let's share.
And reciprocal. Yeah, it's very
Yeah.
reciprocal.
Yeah, so see, that's the thing that in our URECA project now is not, it's like we don't want the students to just go and do their own thing. We want them as to experience and to get immersed a little bit. No, not completely like but we want the Lisa student, Catherine student to come to the lab and interact with do some kind of experiments, get a feeling what's the meaning of extracting the pigment and how do you behave and how do you work with them. And we go to Lisa to really press that thing and then press hard and interact with it. We also go and see we want to go to see the manuscript and how is it used, how do you look at it, and all this kind of things. So it's not like individual thing. We want them to come together with us. So, and I think this comes also from a lot of curiosity and being open-minded.